Let's see. We are on Daf Chav Gimel. We're on page 23A. And what we were dealing with over the past few days is the law of a sukkah that is movable, that moves, and we spoke about the sukkah made on a Rosh Agola, on top of a wagon, Rosh Hasfina, on top of a boat. And then we even had, yesterday, we had a sukkah on top of a animal. So we're dealing with this movable sukkah. We really, it brings up really the Gemara from before, because the Gemara before talked about a bed, and the bed was movable, and created a whole discussion last time when we were on page 21b, because the Gemara there mentioned that the problem with the bed is ein lo keva. It was a little vague what that meant. Ein lo keva, it didn't have permanence. And Rashi understood it to be this idea that it moves, that beds, they move the beds often. I'm not sure if you would say that about our beds today, but at least in the olden days, for whatever reason, maybe because they lived in smaller quarters, so they would move their beds away, put them up, take them down. I don't know, move them around. I'm not exactly sure the practical side of it, why it was that way, but for whatever reason, there seems to be an understanding in the Gemara that a bed was considered very temporary, and the Gemara used the term that Rabbi Yehuda had held, that if you soymech to kosei bekare hamita, Rabbi Yehuda said it's basically puzzle. If it can't stand on its own without the bed, it's considered invalid. Of course, it was the Tanakama, the first view, and the Mishnah said it's kosher, but Rabbi Yehuda said it's invalid. And the reason why Rabbi Yehuda said it's invalid, we had two explanations, and one of them had to do with the fact that it's ein lo keva, it wasn't permanent, and the other one had to do with the fact that it's davar hamakabel tuma. It's something that's susceptible to impurity. A bed was susceptible to impurity, and therefore it would not be valid to hold up the schach because it's called a maimed. So that was the discussion there. Of course, we got into that discussion as well. What's the concept of maimed? Do we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda? If so, then is it a problem having maimed, something that holds the schach? Does that also have to be kosher for schach, or does it have to be something that's not susceptible to impurity? But the other reason is what we were really dealing with regard to movable things, and that was the concept of ein lo keva. That the understanding was that because Rabbi Yehuda holds that a bed is holds that a sukkah needs to be more permanent, so Rashi learned the bed is not really good. The thing is, what does that mean? What would Rabbi Yehuda hold in our Mishnah here on 23? See, it's interesting. The Gemara doesn't really talk about Rabbi. It talks about Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Gamliel. And Rabbi Akiva seems to have no problem with movable sukkahs, but Rabbi Gamliel seems questionable. What really Rabbi Gamliel holds, but seemingly, Rabbi Gamliel would be more leaning towards this idea that it can't move. I mean, we have Rabbi Gamliel saying that a sukkah on top of a boat is not kosher, and there's a discussion if he says the same thing about on top of a wagon. So that was a discussion of the exact version in the Gemara about does the case also include a wagon. But the bottom line is that these all boil down to issues of a movable sukkah, a element of being temporary and so on. Now, if you remember on 21b, so Taisus over there did not like the way Rashi learned the Gemara there, and Taisus wanted to learn differently. And but Taisus did discuss Rashi's interpretation. He says the way Rashi learned, it comes out that Rabbi Yehuda would argue later on page 23 as well, because Rabbi Yehuda holds it needs to be keva, it needs to be permanent. So he would hold that he would also argue about a sukkah that's on a wagon. He would hold that that's not kosher. He would agree with Rabbi Gamliel. And now the problem with Rabbi Gamliel, and this is our Gemara, so we all should try to understand this. Rabbi Gamliel is not so smooth. The reason I say that is the view is, you have to think about it. Rabbi Gamliel says a sukkah needs to be permanent. Now, he holds that on a wagon, it's not kosher. But what about on a boat? On a boat, he doesn't automatically say it's not kosher. He actually says that on a boat depends how sturdy it is. I thought a sukkah that moves is not a kosher sukkah. On a wagon, it's not kosher. Rabbi Yehuda held that on top of a bed is not kosher to move, and all of a sudden on a boat, Rabbi Gamliel starts making exceptions. It's going to be kosher. It depends how sturdy it is. Can it handle this type of wind? It can handle that type of wind. So Rabbi Gamliel's opinion is a complicated view. Why is he making a difference about a boat when officially, if it's movable, it's a problem? So Taisus says it's not. You can answer the question by saying that a boat is usual to dwell in, and therefore it could be, even if it moves, it's considered a kosher sukkah. Anything else is not normal to make a dwelling in. Because of that, it would not be considered keva, not be considered permanent. So that explains Rabbi Gamliel, and that's a Taisus before, and he gives us that understanding that because it's urchatz, it's a normal way people live in boats, so therefore it's considered a kosher, even according to Rabbi Gamliel, as long as it's sturdy. Now,
Rabbi, question.
Yeah.
What about a Conestoga wagon? People used to live in those things when they moved across the plains to move from one place to another. Suppose that why can't I say the same thing about what you're saying for a boat with respect to that kind of wagon?
So my guess is that boats, it was rare to have, it was much more common, I guess, much more common to have a sort of like a dwelling on a boat. On a wagon, it was much less common. It happened, but it was much less common. Again, we don't live in those days, in those times, but this is my understanding that that's the reason why the Gemara would see it that way, and that, with those that perspective. And I was seeing it in those days. It must have been much more usual on a boat than on a wagon. So the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda then, and we touched on this yesterday, that we have the sukkah on top of an animal, and Rabbi Yehuda had a problem with that. He says it's puzzle, it's invalid. And what was the reason? The reason was because he says Chag HaSukkah, it has to be a sukkah that's valid for 7 days. And if it's on an animal, it's not valid for 7 days. That was the problem that Reb Yehuda found. Now, the question on that is, why does he mention that reason? It's movable. It's on an animal. So if Reb Yehuda doesn't like a bed that's movable, why is he going to allow? Why does he need another reason for an animal? Look, on an animal is also movable. And instead, he brings a pasuk, like as if he needs a pasuk to prove it. And the Taishes doesn't answer this question here. However, later on, he does mention that you could say that Taishes on page 21 doesn't answer this question, but on page 2 doors on top of 2 horses, and you make mechitza, you put schach on. Yes.
Rabbi, we just lost your audio for the last like a half a minute or so.
Oh, wow. Okay. I wonder if
it's okay now. It's all right now. It's working. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just guessing that it has to do with if I have to face my in my car. Maybe. Okay.
We're losing it. We lost it again.
Me again? Oh.
Yeah.
Let me see what's going on. Okay. How about now? Now it sounds good?
Yes.
Yeah.
You're doing
Okay.
fine.
All right. So the Taisvis on page 1 had asked this question, and he left it a question. And what was why does he need a verse to tell you that a sukkah on top of an animal is invalid? Why does he need another pasuk for that? Reb Yehuda holds anything that's movable is invalid. And if it's invalid to have a bed, so it's going to be invalid to have a sukkah on top of an animal. And instead, on page 23, he says, there's a pasuk. The pasuk says it has to be usable for 7 days. On top of an animal is not usable. What does he need a pasuk for? It seems like the pasuk is not necessary. It's for sure not good because of a different reason. Because it's mobile. It's movable. It's moving, or it could move. So that's the question that Taisvis asked, and it's only a question on the way Rashi learned the earlier Gemara. It's only a question on the way Rashi learned, because the way Rashi learned was that Rabbi Yehuda's view is that whenever something's movable, it's invalid, and not necessarily is that the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda. Taisvis has another interpretation, and we mentioned it then, and that had to do with the reason of Rabbi Yehuda ein lakeva had to do with the fact that the sukkah is a dira srucha. It's too low because you count from the bed to the roof, and if you make a sukkah on top of a bed, it doesn't really have much of a space for you to dwell there. So it's ein lakeva. So anyway, that was the Taisvis' understanding of the Gemara, and based on that, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't really talk about the sukkah that's moving in the in at least when it comes to a bed. So anyway, Rashi was the question is on Rashi. So how is Rashi going to learn about a sukkah on top of a animal? Taisus on page 21 doesn't answer this question. But then on page 23, Taisus over here on the second Taisus on the page, Taisus says that what is this case where you have a sukkah on top of a animal? So he brings Rashi. And what does Rashi say? It's you put doors on top of two horses, and that's the floor, and you put walls, and you put schach on it. Rabbi Yehuda says it's invalid. He says this is a question. Why does Rabbi Yehuda need a pasuk for it? So he says maybe some Mefarshim explain here we're not talking about that the schach is on top of the animal, because then you wouldn't need a pasuk. You don't need a verse to prove that. If it's on top of the animal, it's a movable sukkah. But rather, what happened here is you have 4 poles. You have schach on top. It's not a kosher sukkah. And then the animal comes in with walls, and all of a sudden you got walls with an animal, and you got a sukkah. You have schach that's permanently there, and your animal just walked into it. So the actual sukkah with the walls part of the sukkah is movable. The schach part of the sukkah is permanent. It's solid. It's stuck in the ground. It has got poles holding it up. So that's where you need a pasuk to tell you that this is a sukkah that's not usable for 7 days. It's not considered a kosher sukkah. So that's what Taisus says. You could explain that that's why he needs the pasuk.
Could you go over that example again?
Yeah. Taisus mentions that there is a scenario where you could say that that's why Rabbi Yehuda needs to bring a pasuk that tells us that an animal sukkah on top of an animal, is not kosher. To us, it sounds surprising. Why does he need a pasuk? It's obvious. It's a mobile sukkah. According to Rabbi Yehuda, such a sukkah is not a valid sukkah. And the Taisus says the case that you need a pasuk to tell you it's not valid is a case where the schach is not mobile. The schach is actually permanent, but the schach is not attached to wall. The schach is just above, and what you have is a mobile wall these walls are on top of an animal. The animal has or two animals, and you have a floor, you have walls, you don't have schach. And that animal with the wall are just below the schach that's permanently attached to the ground with poles. And the animal walks into this type of a pergola. Like the animal walks in with the walls, and you're sitting right there, and you got the wall. Now you have schach on top. You got the schach on top, and the schach is permanent. So Taisus says that would be a case where, on the one hand, you would have to say that it has an element that should be kosher because it's permanent. At least the schach part, and that's the most important part, has to be permanent. And so you don't have Rabbi Yehuda's regular rule of ein la keva, because he says if you look at the schach, there's an option to learn that it's the schach that needs to be permanent. So now the walls part, you got a different problem. You can't climb on it on Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov you can't climb on an animal. So that is where the Rabbi Yehuda says that even in such a case where you have a sukkah on top of an animal and you have schach that's permanent, it's still not going to be kosher because the pasuk says you need to have a sukkah for 7 days. Yeah. So he doesn't need the pasuk to tell you that a regular sukkah on top of an animal is invalid. That was obviously invalid because even on top of a bed is invalid. It's called mobile. It's movable. But the sukkah that's the schach that's permanent, that's where he needs a pasuk to tell you that it's not going to be a kosher sukkah. So that's Taisus' answer here on page 23 to explain Rabbi Yehuda's view. And I think it touches on what Jeffrey was talking about, we were talking about yesterday, with why does he need a pasuk and so on. So we really sort of like touched on this, on the question part of it yesterday. And this Tosfos answers that question.
Rabbi, when you say, I'm sorry.
I still have problems visualizing this. I mean, if you have poles on which you have the schach up on top, and the animal comes in with a sukkah, which, if by definition a sukkah also has to have schach on top of it.
No, there's no schach on top of the animal sukkah. The animal just has wall.
Then you can't call it a sukkah.
Well, the halacha is, even if it's not touching, the halacha is that we say a rule called good asik, that the wall can extend upward, and even if it's not touching the schach, although it could be a case where it's touching, because you could have it exactly flush, where you walk the animal in and it's actually touching the schach. But even if it's not, you have the law of good asik that the wall goes up. And I
understand that, Rabbi. What I'm saying is that if you have the animal, and let's say you have the structure for the sukkah, but without schach sitting on top of the animal, that's not a sukkah. By definition, it's not a sukkah. So you don't have anything up on top. It's only when, so you want to call it a structure, fine, call it a structure. And then when the animal comes in and sits underneath the schach, then you can say, okay, good asik will make it, into valid sukkah, etc. But up until that time, it's an animal with a structure on it, which cannot be called a sukkah because it doesn't have
100%.
on top of it.
100%. You're right. And Rabbi Yehuda is not talking. No one thinks that would be kosher. Everyone is only talking about when it arrives at its destination over there, under the pergola, under the schach part. That's where there's a discussion between Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda if that would be kosher. And Reb Yehuda actually says that it's not kosher. Reb Meir says it's kosher. And the reason why Reb Yehuda doesn't like this sukkah is simply because you can't go on it on Yom Tov or on Shabbos.
Because it's because of the animal. You can't jump on an animal.
The animal, exactly.
Fine, I agree with that. I understand that.
Now, Reb Meir argues with that. Reb Meir would say it's only rabbinic that you can't go on the animal. The sukkah itself is a good sukkah. So they're not talking about when before the animal arrives. They're talking about when the animal is there. And the animal is there, has arrived. That's where the Rabbi Yehuda would say it's still not kosher.
Yeah, but I have a question. You're saying it's a rabbinic, and I'm saying it's a Torah edict. You're told not to use your animal on Shabbat.
So the thing is that for your animal to do malacha is a problem, but it doesn't mean you can't. Biblically, it does. There's no prohibition of touching an animal and using an animal and riding on an animal. It's only a rabbinic decree not to ride on an animal on Shabbos. Now, to go outside of the tchum, maybe could be biblical, but the actual riding or touching an animal is definitely not a problem biblically.
If you go and sit on top of your animal, you're not using your animal.
Not in a transgressing Shabbos, biblically.
Okay.
So,
Rabbi,
okay. Yeah.
My question was, is it the climbing up and climbing down, or just being on the animal?
Well,
here it says in the fine print, it's prohibited to climb up the animal on the first day of Sukkot. Therefore, and it's stuck on top of an animal is unfit because it can't be used for the full 7 days. So is it the climbing up and climbing down, which is a problem? Or
definitely the climbing up. It's definitely the climbing up that's a problem. You want to know if someone were to find themselves on an animal, would they be obligated to go down? That's an interesting question.
No, actually, no, that's not my question. My question is, the climbing up and climbing down is a problem. But if one was to be on the animal without the climbing up and climbing down, would that be allowed?
Right. So that's what that's what I'm telling you. That it's an interesting question in Hilchos Shabbos. That let's say someone put you there, or you were there from before Yontiv or before Shabbos. So would you are you obligated to go down rabbinically from the animal?
Well, it sounds like you can't go down
would-
because the climb. It sounds like you can't go down because the climbing down and the
Right.
climbing up is a problem.
Uh-huh.
Should you just be there? Is the
It
question.
reminds me of there is a halacha. You're not allowed to climb on a tree on Shabbos. If a person climbs on a tree b'mezid on purpose, the penalty is that he's got to stay there the whole Shabbos. So it sounds a little like what you're saying. The penalty is he's got to be stuck there. Like you can't go down. But I don't know if that law applies to riding on an animal. I have to look it up again. These are Hilchos Shabbos questions, which are not so practical, at least in our. Maybe if we lived in the Wild West, where people go horseback, rather have horses and things, we could have such a discussion. It's not something that's on the on my fingertips. The laws
I'm surprised,
of animals.
David, I'm surprised you don't have a picture of this scenario in your
No.
Steinzones. Maybe we could
But I'm
surprise,
sure
'cause
we learned Shabbos.
Although
I'm sure
we did see a
Shabbos is fine.
picture. We did see a picture.
but that
2
was
days
on top
ago.
of that. No, that was different. That was a different picture. That was on top of the camel. This picture is a different story.
Anyway, so let's get back to where we are. So that was so this is just connecting the Gemaras, the previous Gemara and this Gemara, and the discussion of the pasuk that Rabbi Yehuda brings. Anyway, so let's just now that we've connected the Gemaras, let's just remind ourselves about the Gemara that we learned yesterday, and that is that the Mishnah had said talked about cases of the Mishnah talked about cases of on top of a wagon and on top of a boat, and then it also talked about if you have your sukkah that's the walls of the sukkah is based on a tree, or the tree is elevated, the sukkah is elevated, and it's and you have two walls that are man-made, and one wall is the tree wall, and that's supporting the sukkah, and so on. And then the Mishnah talks about, okay, so you have three walls, and then you have the fourth wall is being supported by the tree. Three walls are man-made, that would be kosher, and because the fourth wall you don't need. And then the Mishnah said the Zahaklal, the rule that as long as if you took away the tree, the sukkah would stand, then it's considered kosher, and you could go on it on Yontiv, even though there is a fourth wall that's connected to the tree. And then the Gemara mentioned that this Mishnah goes like Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Gamliel seem to have some story where they were both in a boat, and Rabbi Akiva made a sukkah, and Rabbi Gamliel, it doesn't say if he had a sukkah or not. One explanation is he didn't have a sukkah there. Maybe he was exempt, either oines, he had no option to have a sukkah, it wouldn't work, or he's a traveler. Anyway, Rabbi Akiva made a sukkah, and the sukkah blew away or blew down, and so Rabbi Gamliel, told him, "Where's your sukkah?" So implying like your sukkah was invalid even when it was up, because it was not sturdy enough. And the Gemara Baye mentions that depends on what type of wind the sukkah could withstand just a regular wind for the regular dry land wind. So then, or if it can handle even a regular wind, then for sure everyone agrees it's not kosher. If it could handle even an ocean wind that's it could handle even or a hurricane wind, a wind that's not usual, even the dry land wind that's not usual. Everyone agrees that is kosher. The argument is if it can handle a regular wind of the ocean, but it could handle a regular wind of the dry land, which basically means it handles usual winds, but it can't handle unusual winds. So that is where there's an argument, and Rabbi Akiva, for some reason, held that such a sukkah is kosher. And we discussed yesterday also what the reason is. How could you kosher a sukkah? It's on the ocean, and it's not going to be able to stand. How could you say such a sukkah is a real sukkah? And we said we gave an explanation yesterday that it has to do with the fact that at least it's called a mechitza, because since on dry land this is solid, so you could say it's considered a mechitza. Rabbi Akiva holds the sukkah needs to be a mechitza, but the diras ara it's temporary. So as long as it has the name mechitza, it's considered good enough, even though it's called temporary. And okay, so it's not going to last, but at least it's the actual walls, called walls, and that's considered a kosher sukkah. Rabbi Gamliel says no, it's not going to handle the wind here on the ocean, and therefore it's not going to be. It has to be a diras keva, has to handle the wind. Rabbi Akiva didn't seem to hold so much about the fact that it has to handle the wind. It says connected to the fact that he holds it's in line with how he holds with that the sukkah could be very temporary, and therefore as long as it's considered a mechitza, considered a partition, considered a wall, that's good enough. And he allowed such a sukkah even on the ocean, even on the water, even on a boat. And that was his Rabbi Akiva's view, and that's the Mishnah really, because the Mishnah says that a sukkah on top of a svina is kosher, and you could even go on it on yontiv and on top of a wagon, and basically it has to do with the fact that it's the case. The understanding is that the case is that it's going to blow away even in the ocean wind, and yet it's going to be kosher according to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, and the next Gemara was about on top of the camel, where you have the Mishnah had said that if you have a sukkah on top of a tree, on top of a camel, it's kosher, but you can't go in on yontiv. So the Gemara says this Mishnah must go like Reb Meir, because we know Rabbi Yehuda holds that a sukkah needs to be able to stay for 7 days. Sukkah real shiva, that only a sukkah that's fit for 7 days is considered a sukkah. It's not fit for 7 days. It's not considered a sukkah. So Rabbi Yehuda would hold that in the case of the Mishnah had said that a sukkah on top of an animal is kosher, and Rashi mentioned over there that it's kosher for chol hamoyed. Rashi says it's kosher for chol hamoyed, and Rashi adds, and if you went on it on yontiv, you did fulfill your mitzvah. It's the whole topic of discussion, because isn't that a mitzvah above avera? If you go on it on yontiv, so you went on this tree on yontiv, and you're not supposed to, but you went, so you did fulfill your obligation. Yatsi yedei basei.
It'll be in Perek 3. Perek 3. We'll talk
It's really a little later. We're going to be discussing. Yeah, we're really going to discuss the concept of a mitzvah. If you're doing a mitzvah in an avera at the same time, is the mitzvah really considered a mitzvah?
Rabbi, is the avera rabbinic avera or doraita avera? Isn't that going to be the question? That
right. So that will be an issue that they would, that would be part of this equation. In other words, the rabbis agreed that you're not allowed to go on it on yontiv, and then so you went against the chachamim, and you went on yontiv. Did you fulfill a mitzvah, or did does that ruin the mitzvah? But you're right. It would seem to be less of an issue because it's only rabbinic. But anyway, we'll have to talk about that when we get to the discussion of mitzvah above avera. It's a big topic in Tractate Sukkah, and we'll be talking about it later on in the Masechta. And then, of course, we'll try to. We should come back to over here to this Rashi and deal with the person who went on Yom Tov onto the tree, and is there does everything that Rashi says here, does that fit with the other opinions and so on, fit with the way we understand it over there? But the point over here is that a person, the Mishnah says that it's kosher to make a sukkah on top of an animal, on top of a camel, and the Gemara says that this is the opinion of Reb Meir. that if you make it on top of it, it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda says it's puzzle, and he has a verse. And this was, of course, what we just mentioned 15 minutes ago about if this fits with what we learned before and how you reconcile. Why does he need a verse and so on? Because he's talking about a movable sukkah. It would seem that Rabbi Yehuda would automatically say it's invalid. Here he's bringing a verse, so that we have the Tues over here. They're talking about that case where the schach is permanent, and that would be the reason why he needs a pasuk to tell you. Even in that case, it's not. You can't go on it on Yontif. Okay, now what does Reb Meir do? How would you be allowed to go on this? How would you be? How would you consider it a kosher sukkah if it's not fit for 7 days? So the answer Reb Meir has is it is fit for 7 days. It happens to be rabbinically you can't do it, but is it a kosher sukkah for 7 days? It is. It's usable. Just rabbinically, we sort of like have something blocking us from using it, but it is kosher for 7 days. It's a sukkah that's officially, biblically, it's called fit for 7 days, and therefore Reb Meir says that there's no problem. It's a kosher sukkah. Okay, and now we're up to the Gemara Asa lebehema doifen l'sukkah. We are on page 23a, and let me tell you how many lines. We must be about 25 lines from the top. Let's see, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, maybe about 28 lines. 29 lines from the top of the page on 23a, and Leib Moshe, if you want to know in the art scroll, it must be somewhere around 23, maybe 23a3, I'm guessing. And the paragraph begins that you made the animal a wall, as a wall for your sukkah. So you have 2 walls, solid walls, good walls, and the third wall you have an animal. So your third wall of the sukkah. So also the behema doifen the sukkah. You made the animal a wall for the sukkah. Reb Meir Paisel, Reb Meir says it's invalid. And Reb Meir would say that it's invalid. Now, Reb Meir before said a sukkah on top of a camel is not a problem. That case was you're not using the camel as a wall. You're putting the sukkah on top of the camel, but you have other walls and other schach, and it's not a wall. But here you're using the animal as a wall. Reb Meir says that's invalid. Now Reb Yehuda, Marcheshvan, Reb Yehuda says it's kosher. And now we also have to emphasize here that Reb Yehuda, if the sukkah is leaning and supported by the animal, that's a problem. It must be that it's not being supported by the animal. It's just that the schach is sturdy from some other reason. It's solid, and the sukkah, the animal is just being one of the walls of the sukkah, but it's not going to move the schach. So Reb Yehuda could say that it's kosher. The higher Reb Meir would say that kol davar sheyesh beruach chayim ein oisei oisei loy doifen l'sukkah v'loy lechi l'mavoi. So Reb Meir used to say that anything that's alive is you can't make it as a wall for a sukkah. You can't make it as a lechi, which is that like a pole to allow a mavoi, this alley, to be considered to close off the fourth wall. You can't use something live for that. It has to be like we mentioned, like you use a beam, use a pole, can't be something that has a ruach chayim. So you also can't use an animal for pasin libirois. You can't use it as a pole for the wells, and that was another thing that we've learned before. It had to do with also the laws of Shabbos and Rishus HaYachid to make the well to be considered that you're not taking water from the Rishus HaYachid, which is the well, into the outside, into the Rishus HaRabim and into the public domain. So the way to do it was they would surround it with some type of four corners, and it ended up being considered at least it was acceptable in order to be able to provide water for those that were oila regel, so those that were pilgrimaging to the Beis Hamikdash, so it provided water for their animals, so on. And so ultimately, this type of a mechitza, this type of a wall, was only kosher if it was made of something that wasn't alive. If you wanted to use an animal for it, it would not work. You also can't use an animal like goylel la kever. You can't use it as a goylel or a kever. And this is, of course, a topic of discussion. What that means. The simple understanding is as a cover for a casket, and
Like a mausoleum. It's a cave.
If you use the animal on top of a aron of a mace, doesn't have the laws of goylel, that it's anyone that touches it is tamei. If someone is an oil on top of it is tamei. So the animal, if you put an animal on top of the mace, he doesn't have this special law that applies to goylel. There's another understanding. Tues has an understanding. Tues has an understanding that that goylel means not a cover for the casket. It means a monument. That's the way Tues understands goylel, and it like covers over the whole of the grave, and it's like a big stone.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
I have a picture.
Okay. Okay, you could show us.
Okay.
While he's doing, Rabbi, when they're saying alive, they differentiate between a plant and an animal being alive, or is that two different categories?
Yeah, we're talking about ruach chayim. Yeah,
so it has to be a breathing animal.
Right, exactly.
One that can walk away.
Okay, 1 second. So let's see what we got over here. That's a stone used to seal a burial cave. So here you wanted to use an animal for that. Right. So, okay. Thank you.
It shows you what Rashi says, and according to Tosfos.
Oh, let's see. Okay, so let me read it, because the problem is I'm on my phone here. Let's see if I could read it. Covering for a grave. Rashi holds that the Gemara is referring to the covering of a coffin. According to the Tues and others, it's a large stone that seals the grave. Several burial caves, large stones were found that served as a door to the cave. Such stones were rolled into place, closed the entrance, and rolled away when necessary. So basically, the way it was that they used to bury without like covering with earth. It was like that was the burial location. It was the burial cave, and the cover to that was considered was matame. It had certain laws of tumah called a goylo, and maga, masa, oyel. It would be it had certain laws.
Hi, it's Rachel Olensky calling. I just called. I'm trying to get on to Hilo.
1 second. Let me mute everyone. How do I do this? Participants. 1 second. Mute all. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So, okay, thank you, David. Yeah, I think we understand what the story is. Anyway, the bottom line is that Reb Meir is giving all of his laws about what is considered allowable for a animal, and Reb Meir, he doesn't allow us to use an animal as a wall for a sukkah. So he also doesn't allow us to use an animal for many other things. Again, it's not necessarily connected to it's not exactly the topic of our Gemara, of our tractate, but it just brings in Reb Meir's view in general was that all these davar sheyesh by ruach chayim, things that were live, were not kosher, were not considered items that it was not considered items that were usable for these purposes. So one of them was a goylel kever, and so we just saw Rashi and Taisus over here what that meant, either the cover of the coffin or the cover of the of like a cave or
Rabbi, question.
yeah.
You said that you can't use an animal as a wall. What about if it's the fourth wall?
In
that case the same thing as the tree situation?
Yeah. Seemingly it doesn't ruin anything. You'll see the reason. You'll see in a moment what the reason is. So Rabbi Yossi Aglili Yomer, Rabbi Yossi Aglili Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili Yamru. In the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, they said, Afin Kaisun of Gitei Nashim, you also can't write a divorce document on. In other words, if a person wrote a divorce document on an animal and he hands it to his wife, the woman is not divorced, and we'll see later what the reason for that is. But that's in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. That's also a halacha about a live animal. Now, my time of the Reb Meir. What's the reason of Reb Meir? The Gemara says, Abai says, Shema Thomas. We're afraid that the animal is going to die. And if the animal dies on Yom Tov, and person's not going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Sukkah, and it'll be basically the Sukkah, the wall of your Sukkah will be ruined, and your kosher, the kashrus of your Sukkah will be ruined, and you won't be able to build another Sukkah. So therefore, because you can't make a mechitza on Yom Tov, and so therefore you're not allowed to use it as a wall for your sukkah. Okay. Now, Reb Zera says we're afraid Shema Tivra, the animal might run away, and you'll basically won't have a sukkah. So we're worried either about where the animal will die, and or the animal will run away. Now, the Gemara says, what is the difference between these reasons? It says, the pil kashur, if you have a elephant that's tied, it's securely tied. Kuli amalei pligi. Everyone agrees. Dinami mayas. Even if the elephant dies, yesh benevlasa yasara. Its the carcass will have 10 handbreadths that will allow the sukkah to be considered a wall, and so additionally it's tied down so it can't run away. So in that case, they're not going. Everyone will agree that it's a kosher sukkah and there's no problem. Keep pligi, but what would be a case where they do argue is the fil she'enoi kosher if you have an elephant that's not tied. The man da Amar, according to the opinion that it's Shema Thomas, we're afraid the animal will die. Loi chayshinon, there's nothing to worry about that it's going to die, because even if it dies, it's still the animal's body will still serve as a wall, because they'll just fall in its place, but it'll still be a wall. Manda Amar Gzeira Shema Tivrach, but if we're afraid that it could run away and it's not tied down, so here, Chayshinon, we should be afraid. There's a reason to be afraid that it will run away. So that would be the a case of a difference between these two opinions. If the reason why you can't use an animal is because it might run away, then an elephant would be in the same category. But if the reason is because you're not going to have a sheer sukkah, so if it's an elephant, it doesn't have that problem. Now,
Rabbi, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the dead elephant as the wall of the sukkah.
Thank
all
God
right.
for that.
Maybe send an email to Rabbi Steinsaltz,
Rabbi,
his group. Yes,
Yeah.
Ezra.
yeah,
I guess.
the elephant doesn't have to be tied securely. I think an elephant becomes accustomed to, when you have, for example, a shackle on the elephant, it won't go anywhere. It won't move because it knows it's tied. So it
Oh,
be as far as I know, it doesn't have to be completely securely tied. Well, all it has to know is that there's a shackle on one of its legs, and it's not going to go anywhere.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to ask you how you know that, but that's
I've seen enough circus.
I was going to say, did you used to work in a circus?
No.
Hey, good information. Very nice. Okay, so then the Gemara continues and says, Laman Amar, according to Abaye was the one who said we're afraid the animal might die. So Laman Amar Zeira Shema Tammuz, according to that opinion that says we're afraid it's going to die, that was Abaye. So Neicha Shema Tivrach, why isn't he worried that the animal will run away? Of course, that's common. Animals run away all the time. So why isn't he worried that the animal will run away? So he should prohibit even an animal, even an elephant. It's sort of like it's a question. It really is a question on what we just said. We just said that, well, according to the opinion that we're afraid it's gonna die, an elephant you're not afraid it's gonna die. What do you mean? Shouldn't he also be worried of Shema Tivrach? He should also be worried about the other reason of that it could run away, and therefore this would not be a good difference. So the Gemara says, Ella rather, you're right. Everyone agrees that in such a case, that is going to be a invalid sukkah, because even though the animal could die and it would still stay in its place, but if the animal could run away. So the difference, keep pligi the behema kshura. When do they argue? When you have an animal that is tied, and we're not talking about an elephant here. We're talking about a small animal. So keep pligi the behema kshura. According to the opinion that we're afraid it might die. Chayshinan, we're afraid it might die, and then you won't have the measurement that you need for a sukkah. If you're afraid that it's going to run away, so here it's tied down. There's nothing to worry about. How could it run away? It's tied down, and therefore you don't have to be concerned. And so, in other words, what the Gemara is understanding, and the Gemara asked this question right now, is that if you hold that you're afraid it's going to run away, do you also hold that it might die? In other words, is there a reason to be concerned? The Gemara right now says, maybe you should be concerned also about the other reason. You hold that you're afraid it's going to run away. What about the concern that it might die? The Gemara says, no, this is not necessarily does that opinion hold up, because Misa is Misa is not common. Death is not common, at least according to this opinion. He holds that we don't have to be overly nervous about that, and therefore he's only worried about Shema Tivrach, that it's going to run away, but he's not worried that it's going to die, and therefore an animal that's tied, that can't run away, according to him, it would be a kosher sukkah. According to the other opinion, you're afraid it's going to die, it's not going to be kosher because we're talking about a smaller animal. The animal is going to fall, and it won't be the measurement of 10 handbreadths to make a kosher sukkah. It won't be a wall. It'll be a invalid sukkah. Therefore, we don't allow you to have such a sukkah in the first place. Okay, we're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good day, everybody.